On prior episodes on this channel, we have examined numerous cases of pilots encountering UFOs and meeting their demise. On Saturday, October 21st, 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentich was on a 125-mile training flight when he notified air traffic control of a strange object. After several gargled transmissions, he was never heard from again. On January 7th, 1948, a United States Air Force pilot named Thomas Pantel would perish after chasing an unidentified flying object in the sky. In this episode, we will cover another such case in which the pilot chased a UFO over Lake Superior. He, nor his plane, were ever found. In time, this event has come to be known as the 1953 Kinross Incident. On the night of November 23rd, 1953, a U.S. Air Force F-89 jet fighter being piloted by First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncla and Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson was dispatched from Kinross Air Force Base in Michigan to investigate an unknown object that had been tracked on radar. The jet took off at 11:23 p.m., and at the time, the unidentified flying object was 160 miles northwest of Kinross Air Force Base. As the F-89 jet took off toward the object, ground control radioed the pilots that the UFO had shifted course, indicating the craft was aware the fighter jet was coming toward it. As Mancho and Wilson headed toward the craft, Wilson would begin to have difficulty tracking the UFO. He radioed ground control and notified them, and air traffic controllers would direct the pilots of the object's coordinates. For around 30 minutes, the fighter jet tracked the object, which would move further and further out over Lake Superior. At this point, Mancho and Wilson were gaining ground and catching up to the UFO, flying at an altitude of around 30,000 feet. At some point, the men made their last radio call, and air traffic control operators at ground control watched nervously as the fighter jet flew right to the UFO. Eventually, the blip of the fighter jet moved directly onto the blip from the UFO. As the two blips merged on screen, air traffic control initially believed that the fighter jet had flown directly over the craft and they would diverge in moments. The jet had flown in at 30,000 feet and then proceeded into a steep descent around 8,000 feet. This would not be the case though. As several more beeps passed, the single blip disappeared entirely from the screen. Operators believed that their equipment had malfunctioned, and air traffic control kept trying to radio the two men, but with no luck. After several more minutes, panic began to set in, and air traffic control sent an emergency message to search and rescue, giving the last known position of the jet, which was around 70 miles off Kinawa Point in Upper Michigan. Search and rescue and others would head to the last known position, and after searching all night, nothing would be found. There was no wreckage, no oil slick, or other debris. In the days that followed, more searches were done by the military and civilian parties. The plane, still, was never found. In time, military officials and others would try and sweep the event under the rug. Officials at Norton Air Force Base Flying Safety Division made an official statement saying that the pilot probably suffered from vertigo and crashed into the lake. They would go on to say the UFO was a Canadian DC-3 plane. It's important to note here that Canadian officials stressed none of their aircraft were in the vicinity at the time. In response to this, the Air Force stated that the plane had exploded at a high altitude. However, this explanation didn't make much sense, because if it had exploded in this manner, it would be very likely that search and rescue would have found debris. Before diving into the incident, it's important to understand some basics around Lake Superior. It is the largest freshwater lake in the world, yet it is not in the top 20 in terms of depth. With an average depth of 500 feet and a top depth around 1,300, the lake, relatively speaking, is not that deep. This is an important number to know as we dive into the theories in the search and rescue effort. In addition, we will cover claims by a diving company that alleges to have found the plane. The primary theory on this is that the fighter jet encountered a UFO. What happened next, though, has been hotly debated for centuries. The first theory is the fighter jet simply collided with the UFO. Proponents of this state that the jet lost control and flew right into the craft. The UFO perhaps wasn't expecting the jet to fly directly at it and was caught off guard. As they collided, both crafts fell into the lake and sunk toward the bottom. While this is a popular theory, it does have some obvious weaknesses. Why would the UFO allow itself to be a sitting duck? It seemed to obviously know that the jet was coming. In addition, a wreck like this would surely leave debris in an oil field out in the lake. This leads to the second theory. The UFO simply blasted the jet when it got too close and then disappeared. This explains how the jet went missing and lost communication. It also makes sense on many levels that a UFO would do this rather than just let a fighter jet collide with it. We know these craft are capable of avoiding radar detection, and this could have simply been a test to gauge our military response. Once again, though, the critics of this theory state that debris should have been found if this happened. One other less popular theory is that the craft simply took the jet. Proponents of this theory state that it could explain why the beeps continued in the same place for several moments. Perhaps the craft froze the jet, lifted it into the ship, and then disappeared. The weakness of this theory, though, is that the Air Force would be able to see the altitude of the jet. Still, proponents have suggested that once the plane was frozen, it was disabled from radar detection. While the UFO theory seemed to be the most popular, some suggest this was nothing more than a crash between a Canadian aircraft and a US fighter jet. Since the two nations are friendly, it might have been better for them to sweep it under the rug. Others have suggested it was a commercial aircraft from the United States, but the motivation was the same: not admit embarrassment to the general public. However, this raises the question, wouldn't family members and friends be looking for individuals on that flight? One final theory is that one of the UFO theories holds true and that the government simply chose to cover it up. Perhaps that night, military recovered the craft and jet wreckage. While the plane has never officially been found, there have been some who believe they located it. In the summer of 2005, the Great Lakes Dive Company went out on Lake Superior to test new equipment on two wrecks from 1919. With some extra time, they decided to look for the missing fighter pilot jet. Using advanced sonar technology, the group was able to capture several photos indicating the jet could be below. In addition, nearby, there was something else in the water, according to the group. However, none of what they found appears to be conclusive, and there's not much on this organization. Many have even gone so far to say they never existed, and this all was just an internet rumor. While there doesn't appear to be hard evidence or a conclusion yet, hopefully, in time, we will discover this strange aviation mystery.